Welcome back, U.S. History people. We have video number 3 for you today. This one is on indentured servitude and slavery in colonial America. We're going to talk about the origins of each and the short-term impacts, but the long-term impacts will really be examined throughout this course. So we're going to really go over the origins, but this is a theme that we will keep coming back to as we continue throughout this year. So let's start off by identifying and understanding what indentured servitude is. And this is when a person, usually a male, from Europe has their passage to America paid, and they work for several years in return to pay off the debt. So if you are a poor farmer living in England and you want to emigrate to America but you can't afford it, somebody would pay for you to come over and you would work for them from anywhere from 4 to 7 years. Now in the 17th century, the early 1600s, this was the most common form of labor in the Chesapeake. We talked about the Chesapeake in the last video. That's Maryland and Virginia. So a large portion of farmers in the Chesapeake were indentured servants. Now that's going to change in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion. You can see Bacon here in the middle, a whole bunch of angry people next to him, and they're burning down Jamestown. This was a rebellion of landless whites, many of them former indentured servants who did not have land, and they wanted land in Jamestown, but it was unavailable. It was all owned already. So they began to go on the outskirts of Jamestown and then ran into conflict with Native Americans. As we know, there was conflict with Native Americans over land. So they rebelled, and this led plantation owners to want a permanent source of labor instead of a temporary source of labor that lasted 4 to 7 years. So this will be a huge reason for the growth of slavery.
All right, so moving on to our next slide is the issue of slavery. And it's imperative when studying American history, and specifically the colonial period we're talking about, that we understand the issue of slavery. And I will kind of say right now, and Mr. Norris, please jump in here too, that this is an institution that has had a huge impact on American history. It's a terrible institution, and I don't think that we as teachers can really do enough to explain how terrible this institution was. But it was something that existed in the American colonies, and unfortunately slavery is something that has existed throughout human history, but it played a unique role in the development of the American colonies, and specifically the United States as a nation. So it's something we will be talking a lot about, and we'll have to continue to go back to. So it's important when we look at colonial history that we understand in all 13 British colonies that made up the Americas, slavery was an institution that existed. We will see in certain regions it becomes more predominant than others. When we first start off, slavery is in all 13 colonies. Over time, it did become more concentrated in the southern states as a result of a different form of economy that we talked about in previous videos. In some areas, slaves actually outnumbered European colonists based on the region or the colony itself.
And this will lead to colonial legislatures and then later state legislatures passing laws that will severely restrict the rights of African Americans.
So what differentiates slavery in the Americas compared to maybe slavery that existed in ancient societies is that slavery in the Americas was specifically based on the issue of race. Race became a defining factor in what constituted a slave at this time period. And a phrase that we have to be aware of when we study slavery in the Americas is the phrase chattel slavery. And what this means is slaves were seen as actual property and could be bought and sold, and specifically children of slaves were born into the institution of slavery.
Okay, so let's understand the reasons that African slavery developed. So some causation going on here. There's a high European demand for cash crops, specifically tobacco, that we've talked about in the previous videos. And tobacco requires a lot of work on plantations. There's also a difficulty in enslaving Native Americans because they knew the land well, they could run away, but unfortunately many of them died due to European diseases, so there's a high death rate. There's also a decline of indentured servants, which I started the video talking about with Bacon's Rebellion. So after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, and many Europeans not wanting to work in places like the West Indies or South Carolina, where it was very hot and very arduous labor, there was an indentured servant shortage, and many plantation owners then began to switch to African slavery.
All right, so what are some consequences that we see of the growth of slavery in the American colonies? So as Mr. Norris said, with the death of many natives, a shift happened in forced labor into bringing Africans across the Middle Passage, across the Atlantic from the continent of Africa to the American colonies. And as this resulted, you saw a differentiation of strict racial systems between European ancestry and African ancestry. So interracial relationships were considered illegal, specifically in southern colonies. So it was a violation of law to have any interracial relationships. And this will actually exist through colonial periods all the way up through much more modern history as well. So the mother's status would determine the status of her children. So if a mother was born into slavery, her children would also be born into the institution of slavery, regardless of the father's status. So unfortunately, we would see at times plantation owners force relationships on female slaves, and as a result, those children would be born into slavery. We would see the emergence of strict slave codes. Laws to regulate the behavior of slaves would be developed.
One thing that slaves are going to want to do is preserve their autonomy. And if you could circle this word for us, please, and this means independence or self-rule. They're going to want to have some sort of control over their situation. So slaves will often resist in passive ways, such as working slowly, running away, breaking tools, faking illness, something to disrupt the everyday work that they were forced to do. You would also see overt resistance, such as rebellions. This rarely happened, but it did. But you would see slaves rebelling against their situation. A famous example is the Stono Rebellion, located near Charleston, South Carolina. This was from 1739, in which many slaves killed whites, and they tried to flee to Spanish Florida, where they would be free because they would be escaping the rule of England. You also see the development of surrogate families when families were broken up. And what we mean by that is you would see slaves essentially adopt family members or look after family members that were sold to other plantations. And then finally, there is a blend of African and American culture and religion. So a lot of slaves would combine elements of the religion from Africa with elements of Christianity.
All right, so let's do a quick recap of this video. So we talked about earlier in the video the difference between indentured servants versus slaves. So Mr. Norris, you want to give us a quick recap of the difference between the two?
So indentured servants worked for 4 to 7 years in exchange for a passage from Europe to the Americas, where slaves were forced to work for the rest of their life, and it was based on race, and the status was determined based on the mother.
So very important when we're studying colonial America that we understand that slavery was located in all 13 colonies. The reasons for the growth of slavery, we talked about European demand for goods, difficulty enslaving natives, and also the decline in indentured servitude. We discussed slavery was determined by the status of the mother. Slaves sought to preserve their autonomy.
All right, we will see you back here for video number 4. We're jumping over to colonial political institutions with a focus on the different regions of the Americas. Thank you, as always, for watching, and have a good day.